My name is Isabel Laurent. I'm 62 years old. And what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about the quiet old lady living down the street. 5 years ago, I buried my husband. Tonight, I buried the woman I pretended to be ever since. It all started with a sound I'll never forget, the frantic ringing of my doorbell long after midnight. On the other side of the door was my daughter, Sophie. The cold Boston air clung to her, but that wasn't why she was shaking. The red mark on her cheek was the only color in her pale, tear-streaked face. My son-in-law, Mark Covington, had hit her. He thought he could. After all, who was I? Just Isabel, the grieving widow of a university professor, living a quiet, modest life in the suburbs, tending to my roses, a woman who probably worried about grocery coupons and the weather. He saw me as a harmless, slightly pathetic old woman, completely dependent on the scraps of goodwill he showed my daughter. He had no idea that the pension I was living on was just the pocket change from a $90 million real estate empire I built from the ground up. He didn't know that the woman in the faded gardening cardigan could buy and dismantle his entire arrogant existence before the sun came up. But that night, holding my trembling daughter, I wasn't a CEO. I was a mother. And a cold, calculated rage I hadn't felt in decades woke from its slumber. Mark had made the fatal mistake of underestimating me. He was about to find out that some old women don't just knit sweaters. They knit coffins for men who hurt their family. This isn't just a story about getting even, it's about a mother's promise, and the methodical destruction of a man who thought he was untouchable. To understand how I did it, you'll need to hear it all from the beginning. This is a long and painful story, and I'll need a friend to see it through. To be sure you hear how it all ends, you can follow the stories told here. That way, you won't miss what I found next. I settled Sophie into the guest room, the same one she used as a teenager when she'd had a fight with a friend or watched a scary movie. I pulled a quilt over her, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing as sleep finally took her. The moonlight cut across the floor, and in that quiet, sterile light, the red mark on her face seemed to glow with a life of its own. A brand. A warning. The fury inside me was so immense, so cold, it felt like a block of ice forming in my chest. I wanted to scream, to break something, to call Mark and unleash a torrent of threats he couldn't possibly comprehend. But I did none of that. The woman who built an empire knew that rage is a fire. If you let it burn wild, it consumes you. But if you channel it, it can forge steel. The next morning, Sophie sat at my kitchen table, picking at a piece of toast. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the floral pattern on her plate and whispered the excuses he had clearly coached her to say. She told me he didn't mean it, that he was under an impossible amount of pressure at work with his company, Innovatech Solutions. She said they'd been arguing about money, and he just snapped. Every word felt like a lie she was trying to sell to herself as much as to me. The way she said it, her voice hollow and thin, told me this wasn't the first time she'd had to make excuses for him. This was just the first time he'd left a mark someone else could see. That was the first crack in the facade. The story didn't fit. Mark was the CEO of a rising tech firm, a man who graced the pages of local business magazines. Men like that don't snap over money unless the pressure is more than just pressure. It's a ticking bomb, and I had a sickening feeling my daughter was sitting right next to it. I let her believe I accepted her story. I made her tea, told her she could stay as long as she needed, and talked about pruning the rose bushes. I played the part of the gentle, slightly naive mother, but that night, after she'd fallen into another restless sleep, I walked into my home office, a room she thought was just for paying bills and organizing old photo albums. I closed the door, the click of the latch echoing in the silent house. It felt like locking away the old Isabel for good. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and alert even at that late hour. Isabel, is everything all right? Arthur Davis, my lawyer, my confidant, the keeper of all my secrets for 30 years. He was the only person on earth who knew the full extent of my wealth and the intricate web of holding companies I used to manage it. Arthos, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the fire in my gut. I need you to start digging into Mark Covington's finances, personal and corporate, leave no stone unturned. I want to know every dollar he has, every dollar he owes, and every dollar he's ever touched. And do it quietly. No one can know I'm looking. The silence on the other end was heavy with understanding. Arthur didn't ask why. He knew me well enough to know that when I gave an order like that, the time for questions was long past. He simply said, "Consider it done." 3 days later, an email with a single, encrypted file landed in my inbox. My heart hammered against my ribs as I typed in the password. The document that opened was a cold, black and white summary of a life unraveling. It was so much worse than I had imagined. Mark wasn't just under pressure, he was being crushed under a mountain of debt. High-risk personal loans from lenders I'd never heard of, a fortune lost in reckless cryptocurrency gambles, credit card statements that detailed a lifestyle of five-star hotels, expensive cars, and designer watches that his CEO salary couldn't possibly support. He was a fraud, living a life he hadn't earned. But that wasn't the part that made the air leave my lungs. That wasn't the discovery that made my blood run cold. I scrolled down to the collateral section of the loans, and there they were. 3 properties, a condo downtown, a small house near the Cape, and a commercial storefront. Properties I didn't recognize. But Arthur, in his thoroughness, had pulled the deeds. My eye scanned the documents until they landed on the owner's name. Sophie Lauren? They were properties I had bought for her years ago, placed in a secure trust fund meant to guarantee her future, a future I had worked my entire life to provide. He had somehow coerced her into signing them over as security for his own catastrophic failures. He was systematically selling off her future to pay for his past. I finally understood the argument about money, the pressure, the slap. It wasn't a moment of losing control. It was a calculated act of intimidation. My daughter wasn't his partner. She was his collateral. For a full day after Arthur's email, I did nothing but sit with the information. I let the cold, hard facts seep into my bones. He had used my daughter. He had targeted her trust, her love, and her financial ignorance as a weapon against her. My grief for the man I thought he was, for the happy marriage I thought Sophie had, was replaced by something much colder: purpose. Arthur's investigation was the aerial view, the map of the battlefield. Now I needed to be a soldier on the ground. I needed to see the enemy's territory with my own eyes. I needed to get inside their house. Playing the part of the concerned mother was my way in. I called Sophie, my voice filled with practiced warmth, and suggested a girls' day. Lunch at her favorite cafe, maybe a walk through the public garden. I told her it would do her good to get out of the house for a bit. She was hesitant, conditioned to stay close to home, but the idea of a few hours of normalcy was too tempting to resist. While we were out, I casually mentioned that the evenings were getting chilly and that I'd left my favorite cashmere shawl at her place the last time I'd visited. I told her we could just swing by quickly so I could grab it. She gave me her house key without a second thought, telling me to let myself in, as she planned to go visit a friend after our lunch. It was that easy. Her trust in me was the key that would unlock her husband's secrets. Walking into their home felt different this time. Before, it was just Mark and Sophie's place, a little too modern for my taste, all chrome and glass, but filled with their life. Now, it felt like a crime scene. The air was thick with unspoken truths. The faint, expensive scent of Mark's cologne lingered in the hallway, and it made my stomach turn. I found my shawl draped over a chair in the living room, completing my alibi. Then, I went straight to his office. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Every noise outside a passing car, a dog barking sounded, like him returning home unexpectedly. His office was immaculate. A massive oak desk, perfectly organized. Books on leadership and innovation lined the shelves. It was the carefully constructed image of a successful man. But I knew it was all a lie. I started with the desk drawers, sifting through papers, looking for anything that matched the loan documents Arthur had found. Nothing. It was all too clean. He wasn't stupid enough to leave a trail of evidence out in the plain. Defeated, I sank into his expensive leather office chair. Where would a man like Mark hide his darkest secrets? Not where someone could find them, but where he could access them easily. My eyes scanned the room again. The books. They weren't just for show. They were props. I started pulling them from the shelf one by one. The Art of the Deal. Think and Grow Rich. And then I saw it, a thick biography of Steve Jobs. It was heavier than it should have been. I flipped it open, and my breath caught in my throat. The center of the book had been hollowed out. Tucked inside wasn't a weapon or cash, but a slim, silver USB drive. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely insert it into my laptop. There were dozens of files, mostly boring corporate documents, but then I saw a folder titled Q3 Projections, SV Sterling Ventures. The name from Arthur's report about the new funding round. I clicked it open. Inside were two files. One was a PowerPoint presentation, Innovitech, the Future of Tech. The other was an Excel spreadsheet simply named Master_Finance. I opened the presentation first. It was beautiful. Sleek graphics, upward trending charts, and projected profits that were astronomical. It painted a picture of a company on the verge of global domination. It was a story Mark was selling to his investors, to his board, to the world. It was a masterpiece of fiction. Then I opened the spreadsheet. The numbers were terrifying. A sea of red ink, sales figures that were a fraction of what he was claiming, debt-to-income ratios that were catastrophic. The company wasn't growing. It was hemorrhaging money. He wasn't on the verge of success. He was weeks, maybe days, away from a complete and total collapse. He hadn't just inflated the numbers in his presentation. He had invented them out of thin air. This wasn't just desperation. This was massive, intentional, criminal fraud. For 5 years, I had made excuses for his arrogance, chalking it up to ambition. I'd seen him as my daughter's husband, holding the proof of his lies. Seeing the two realities side beside you, the dazzling fantasy and the bleak truth, he finally saw him for what he was. He wasn't just a bad husband or a failed businessman. He was a predator who would burn down the whole world, starting with my daughter, just to stay warm for one more night. I drove home from Sophie's house on autopilot, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silver USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in my purse. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sick. Seeing the raw data, the 2 sets of books, was like looking directly into the abyss of his soul. There was no bottom. Back in the sanctuary of my office, I uploaded the files from the USB drive, encrypted them, and sent them to Arthur with a 1-sentence message. Cross-reference this with your findings, especially SV. While I waited, I found myself wandering into the living room. On the mantelpiece sat a silver-framed photo of Sophie and Mark's wedding day. It was taken just after the ceremony. They were both beaming, Sophie looking radiant and hopeful, Mark looking proud and charming. I remembered that day so clearly. I remembered telling my late husband, just weeks before he passed, that I felt Sophie was in good hands. I had trusted Mark. I had welcomed him into our family, into our lives, and seen him not as a son-in-law, but as a son. I looked at the smiling man in the photo, the man who had held my daughter's hand and promised to love and protect her, and I felt a profound, aching sadness. I wasn't just mourning the man he pretended to be. I was mourning my own judgment. I had been so wrong. I had let a wolf into the fold, and he had been devouring my lamb in silence all this time. My phone rang 2 hours later. Pulling me from my haze, it was Act 2. His voice was different. It had lost its professional detachment. It sounded strained, almost disbelieving. He told me the files were a gold mine. The fraud was blatant, extensive, and amounted to multiple federal crimes. Mark was juggling dozens of lies, moving money between accounts to create the illusion of revenue, essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul just to keep the lights on for one more day. But then, his voice dropped lower. He told me he had done what I asked. He'd investigated Sterling Ventures, the venture capital firm Mark was so desperately trying to court for his next round of funding. Arthur explained that Sterling Ventures was owned by a larger investment group, which in turn was a subsidiary of a national asset management firm. It was all very standard, very boring. But Arthur, being Arthur, didn't stop there. He followed the chain of ownership, peeling back the layers of shell corporations and obscurely named trusts. a path he knew intimately because he had helped me create it decades ago. He followed it all the way to the top. There was a long pause on the line before he spoke again. "Isabel," he said, and the gravity in his voice made the hair on my arms stand up. "Sterling Ventures, .. It's you. It's one of your holding companies." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the edge of my desk to steady myself. The pieces of the puzzle didn't just fall into place. They crashed together with the force of a tectonic shift. It was a revelation so staggering, so darkly poetic, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Mark, my arrogant, abusive, fraudulent son-in-law, was using the properties he had stolen from my daughter as leverage to appear solvent, so he could put on a convincing show for new investors. And he had, through sheer, blind, stupid luck, chosen to beg for money from me. He was standing at my front door, hat in hand, using my daughter's stolen future as his calling card, with absolutely no idea who he was talking to. The cruelty of the scheme was breathtaking. He wasn't just trying to con strangers, he was unknowingly trying to complete the circle, using my family's assets to solicit my own hidden wealth to cover up his crimes against my own child. That was the moment the sadness shattered. It evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, diamond-hard resolve. The woman who had clawed her way up from nothing, who had outsmarted condescending men in boardrooms her entire life, the woman I had put into a quiet retirement, woke up, and she was furious. He thought my world was small. A little house, a garden, a pension. He had no idea. He hadn't just picked a fight with a poor old woman. He had picked a fight with the owner of his entire, pathetic universe. And I was about to make it collapse on top of him. Knowing Mark's secret changed the very air I breathed. My quiet, suburban house was no longer a retirement home. It was a command center. My garden wasn't a hobby. It was my cover. I now understood that my greatest weapon was the very thing Mark despised me for, my perceived weakness. He saw a frail, clueless old woman, and I would give him the performance of a lifetime. The time for covert investigation was over. It was time to engage the enemy directly, but from behind a mask of smiling ignorance. My opening move was a classic one, the family dinner. I called Sophie and insisted that she and Mark come over. I told her I was worried about them, that I hated the tension between them, and that a nice home-cooked meal was the best way to mend fences. It was the perfect role for me to play the well-meaning, slightly meddling Sophie, ever hopeful, agreed immediately. I knew Mark would come. It was a chance for him to reinforce his control, to put on a show of the loving husband in my presence, and ensure Sophie stayed in line. That evening, as I set the table, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the same feeling I used to get before a high-stakes negotiation. My hands were steady as I took my best roast chicken out of the oven. The smell filled the house, a comforting, domestic aroma that was a complete lie. This wasn't a home, it was a stage. When they arrived, Mark was exactly as I expected, condescendingly charming. He gave me a brief, dismissive hug that felt like patting a dog, and handed me a cheap bottle of wine with a flourish, as if it were a grand gift. Throughout dinner, I played my part. I asked him about work with wide-eyed, simple questions. I'd say things like, "It must be so complicated, all that computer stuff," and he would launch into patronizing explanations, simplifying concepts as if I were a slow-witted child. He'd occasionally pat Sophie's hand, a gesture that looked supportive to an outsider, but I could see the slight flinch in her muscles. He was performing for me, and I was performing for him. We were two actors in a play, but only one of us knew the ending. I waited until dessert to set my trap. I served a slice of apple pie, the picture of grandmotherly care. "Sophie mentioned you've been under a lot of stress at work," I began, my voice soft and concerned. "But she said you were expecting some wonderful news soon. Something about a company. Sterling Ventures. It sounds so important." His chest puffed out. His eyes lit up with arrogance. This was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to brag to the simple old woman and prove his worth. He told me that Sterling Ventures was a top-tier investment firm and that they were about to close a massive deal within. He leaned forward, his voice dropping as if sharing a huge secret. He said the deal was so significant it would realign their entire financial outlook for the next decade. Realigned. The word hung in the air, a sanitized corporate euphemism for fix my fraudulent books. He was so caught up in his own ego that he couldn't stop himself. He told me he was planning the grand announcement. It wouldn't be some boring press release. He was going to reveal the partnership live, on stage, at the Innovatech annual gala in 2 weeks. He described the event in detail: the grand ballroom, the press, the most important people in Boston's tech scene, all in attendance. He told me, with a smug smile, that it would be the single greatest night of his professional life. The night that would silence all his critics and solidify his legacy. I just smiled, taking a slow bite of pie. I told him that sounded just wonderful, and that he must be very proud. He and Sophie left soon after. I stood at the window and watched their car pull away, the red taillights disappearing into the dark. The smile fell from my face. The house was silent again. The plates on the table, the only evidence of the battle that had just taken place. He had walked into my home expecting to find a fool. He thought he had spent the evening managing my ignorance and reinforcing his power. Little did he know, he hadn't been managing me at all. He had been and he had just handed me the time, the place, and the stage for his public execution. Mark had given me the stage for his downfall, the Innovatech Gala. With a date now circled in red on my calendar, my mission shifted. I was no longer just reacting to his crimes. I was proactively architecting his demise. The financial fraud was enough to send him to prison, of course, but it didn't feel like enough. It explained the what, but not the why. Why the cruelty? Why the slap? Why systematically dismantle my daughter's future with such cold precision? I felt a gnawing certainty that there was another layer to his depravity, a deeper, more personal rot that I hadn't yet uncovered. To truly destroy a man like Mark, I needed to understand what he loved, what he feared, and what truly drove him. I called Arthur again, but my instructions were different this time. I told him to pull back from the corporate forensics for a moment and deploy his best private investigator. The target was no longer Innovatech's balance sheets, but Mark Covington's personal life. I wanted to know where he went when he told Sophie he was working late. I wanted to know who he was talking to. I wanted a complete picture of the man, not the CEO. The days that followed were a strange exercise in duality. In the mornings, I would be in the garden with Sophie, who was still staying with me. We'd talk about flowers and books, and I'd see a little of the old light returning to her eyes. She was slowly healing, finding her footing away from his shadow. I played the part of the nurturing mother, making her soup, encouraging her to rest. But in the afternoons, I would retreat to my office and review the investigators' daily reports. They arrived in the same encrypted fashion as Arthur's financial files, but they felt dirtier, more invasive. They were filled with grainy photos, timelines of his movements, and summaries of his expenses. At first, the findings were predictable for a man in his position. Lavish lunches with people who weren't on the Innovatech payroll, purchases at designer stores for items Sophie never received. But then, a pattern began to emerge. A series of small, consistent anomalies. A recurring weekly payment to a high-end floral service in a different part of the city. Regular visits to a luxury apartment building in the Seaport District, a place he had no reason to be, and a monthly wire transfer, always for the same significant amount, to a woman named Chloe Dubois. Arthur's team quickly built a profile on her. She was an aspiring art gallery owner in her late 20s. Her gallery, which had recently closed, had been funded by a single anonymous investor. Her apartment was leased by a shell corporation that Arthur traced back to a secret account controlled by Mark Covington. The picture was sickeningly clear. Mark was living a double life. But the real gut punch, the revelation that made me feel like the floor had dropped out from beneath me, came when Arthur sent me the timeline. He had cross-referenced the start of the apartment lease, the first wire transfer to Chloe, the incorporation of her gallery, and then he placed another date on that timeline. The day Mark proposed to my daughter. Mark had met Chloe Dubois 6 months before he even asked Sophie to marry him. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, devastating clarity. Sophie wasn't the love of his life who he had betrayed. She was never the love of his life at all. She was part of the business plan. He had met my daughter, sized up our family oven in our modest, deceptive presentation, and saw an opportunity, a stable, respectable girl from a good family, who he likely assumed had a tidy inheritance waiting for her. He married her with the specific, premeditated intention of using her as a financial engine to fund his real life, his real relationship with this other woman. Every "I love you," every anniversary dinner, every shared moment for the past 5 years had been a transaction, a performance to ensure his primary investor remained compliant. The cruelty wasn't a bug. It was a feature of his grand design. I looked at the file on my screen, at the picture of this woman, at the dates that laid out 5 years of my daughter's life as nothing more than a column in a ledger. The anger I felt was no longer hot. It was glacial. It was absolute. I had thought his greatest crime was greed. I now understood it was something far more profound. He hadn't just stolen Sophie's money, he had stolen her reality. He had stolen her youth, and I was going to make him pay for it. Not in dollars and cents, but in the complete and utter annihilation of the world he had built on her bones. The knowledge of Mark's original Cinda, calculated deception of his marriage, gave my mission a chilling focus. The gallows was my endgame, but a public accusation, even with my evidence, could be messy. Mark was charismatic. He could try to paint me as a hysterical, grieving woman, a scorned mother-in-law on a vendetta. The corporate fraud documents were complex. The story of his affair was personal. To make the takedown absolute, to leave no room for doubt, I needed to pierce the corporate veil he hid behind. I needed a voice from the inside. I needed an ally he had wronged. I tasked Arthur with a new kind of search, not for assets or hidden accounts, but for people. I asked him to compile a list of every senior employee who had left Innovetic in the last year. I wanted to know who had resigned, who had been laid off, and most importantly, who had been fired. A man as reckless as Mark, scrambling to cover his tracks, would have certainly created enemies. He would have betrayed people on his way down. It didn't take long for Arthur to find the perfect candidate, David Chun. He was Innovetic's original CFO, a numbers wizard who was renowned for his integrity. He and Mark had built the company from the ground up. Yet, 3 months ago, he had been abruptly fired for, according to the official statement, performance issues and strategic disagreements. The timing was too perfect. It was right when Mark's financial situation had become a 5-alarm fire. I knew in my gut that David Chun's only performance issue was that he had a conscience. Securing him was a delicate operation. I couldn't send Arthur, as a lawyer's inquiry would set off alarm bells. This had to be personal. My investigator provided me with David's routine. A small coffee shop downtown where he went every morning at 8 a.m. to read the paper. The next day, I was there, sitting at a small table with a cup of tea, dressed in my most unassuming cardigan. I looked like any other retired woman enjoying her morning. When he walked in, I recognized him from the photos. He looked tired, the stress of unemployment and a ruined reputation weighing on him. I waited until he had settled with his coffee before I approached his table. I kept my voice soft, my demeanor gentle. I introduced myself as Isabel Laurent, Sophie Covington's mother. His eyes widened slightly in recognition. He became guarded, wary. I didn't present myself as a threat or a millionaire strategist. I presented myself as a worried mother. I told him I was concerned about my daughter and the immense pressure her husband was under. I explained that I had stumbled upon some financial information about Innovetic that I didn't understand, and that it seemed to suggest the company was in serious trouble. I mentioned that I knew his departure was sudden, and that I couldn't help but feel it was all connected. I looked him straight in the eye and asked him if he was fired because he refused to do something he knew was wrong. For a long moment, he just stared at me. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the fear of Mark's retribution, the constraints of the non-disclosure agreement he was surely forced to sign, warring with a deep-seated desire for the truth to come out. Finally, he gave a slow, weary nod. He told me the story. He confirmed that Mark had ordered him, in no uncertain terms, to cook the books, to invent revenue, hide losses, and create a fraudulent financial portrait of the company to lure in sterling ventures. When David refused, Mark threatened him, then fired him, and had Innovetec's lawyers threatened to ruin him financially if he ever breathed a word of it to anyone. I listened patiently, and when he was done, I leaned in slightly. I told him I believed him, and that the man he described was the man I now knew my son-in-law to be. And then I offered him something he didn't have, a way to fight back. That was when the final, crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place. A small, bitter smile touched David's lips. He told me he had a feeling this day might come. He said that on his last day, after he was fired but before his system access was revoked, he had taken out an insurance policy. He had downloaded a complete, undoctored copy of the company's real financial ledgers. More than that, he had a separate file documenting every single fraudulent change Mark had ordered him to make, complete with dates and Mark's own notes from their internal messages. It was the smoking gun. It was the Rosetta Stone that would translate Mark's lies into his conviction. He agreed to give it all to me. The NDA was legally worthless, as it was being used to conceal a crime. He would be my star witness. I left the coffee shop and walked out into the crisp morning air, my purse feeling heavier than it had before. Mark had built his empire on lies, silencing anyone who dared to speak the truth. He never imagined that the quiet, tired man he had fired would find a new ally. He never imagined his downfall would be orchestrated by the one person he was most certain he had fooled. With David Chun's explosive evidence secured, the arsenal was complete. Sitting in my office, I laid out all the pieces of my counterattack like a general preparing for battle. I had the irrefutable proof of massive corporate fraud, thanks to Mark's own hubris and David's foresight. I had the cold, hard timeline of his personal betrayal, proving his marriage was a premeditated financial strategy. I had a credible, unimpeachable witness ready to testify. And hovering over it all like a ghost he couldn't see was my secret ownership of Sterling Ventures, the ace. I had yet to play. I had the weapons. I had the motive. Now I needed to perfect the execution. Mark had already chosen the location for me, the Innovitech annual gala. His stage of triumph would be my court of judgment. I had Arthur obtain the complete program for the evening. I studied it like a military strategist. The guest list was a who's who of Boston's tech and finance elite. The city's most influential business journalists would be there. The board of directors, the very people Mark had been deceiving, would be at the head table. It was perfect. A room full of everyone whose opinion he valued, everyone he desperately needed to impress. Before I could finalize the plan, however, there was one last, delicate piece to move into place. Sophie. She was still healing under my roof, shielded from the storm I was about to unleash. Telling her everything at once, the scale of the fraud, the double life, my secret empire would be too cruel, too overwhelming. But she couldn't stay in the dark forever. She needed to see him for who he was, with her own eyes, to truly break free. One afternoon, I sat with her in the sunroom. I took her hands in mine and told her a carefully edited version of the truth. I explained that my investigation had confirmed that Mark was in serious financial trouble and had committed fraud. I told her he had betrayed her trust in ways that went beyond money. I saw the familiar pain and confusion in her eyes, the ingrained instinct to defend him. So I didn't ask her to believe me. I asked her to trust me. I told her that the full truth would be revealed at the gala, and that for her own future, for her own closure, she needed to be there to witness it. Reluctantly, seeing the steel in my eyes, she agreed. I knew it was a risk, but it was a necessary one. Her illusions had to be shattered by the man himself, not just by her mother's words. With Sophie on board, I turned my attention back to the gala schedule. Cocktail hour, dinner, a few minor awards, and then, at 9:30 p.m., the keynote address by CEO Mark Covington, culminating in a major strategic partnership announcement. That was it. That was the moment. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. My plan crystallized, no longer a vague idea, but a perfectly choreographed sequence of events. I wouldn't stop him at the door. I wouldn't have Arthur serve him papers during dinner. No, that would be too simple, too merciful. I would let him have his moment. I would let him walk onto that stage, bask in the applause, and stand under the warm glow of the spotlight. I would let him deliver his entire speech, weaving his grand narrative of innovation and success. I would let him thank his board for their unwavering faith and the press for their glowing coverage. I would even let him look out into the audience, find my daughter's face, and thank his beautiful, supportive wife. I would let him climb to the absolute pinnacle of his fraudulent life. And only then, at the very second he was about to announce the name of his saviors, Sterling Ventures, would I make my entrance. The fall would be so much more devastating from the highest possible point. The final pieces clicked into place. I instructed Arthur to have all the evidence, the 2 sets of books, David's annotated ledger, the timeline of the affair, complete with photos of Chloe and copies of her apartment, least formatted into a brutal, undeniable slideshow. Using my authority as the owner of Sterling Ventures, I arranged for my team to have discreet access to the ballroom's AV controls. I purchased a ticket for Sophie under a maiden name. Finally, I went to my closet and pushed past the sensible cardigans and comfortable shoes. In the very back, preserved in a garment bag, was the armor from my former life, a custom-tailored designer suit, sharp and severe, the color of midnight. The invitation on my desk promised an evening of celebration. Mark thought it was the beginning of his new empire. He had no idea he was the guest of honor at his own funeral. The day of the gala arrived with a surreal stillness. The house was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. My suit, the color of midnight, was hanging on my wardrobe door, a silent testament to the woman I was about to become again. Every part of the plan was in place. Every piece was on its designated square. Arthur, David, and my technical team were all on standby, each with their role to play. There were no more calls to make, no more evidence to gather. All that was left was to let the clock tick down to 0. I spent most of the afternoon with Sophie. She was a storm of nervous energy, pacing the living room, twisting a ring around her finger. She was putting on a brave face, but I could see the terror in her eyes. The gala was Mark's world, a place where he was a king. For 5 years, she had been the quiet, supportive queen consort. The thought of returning there, knowing a confrontation was imminent, was tearing her apart. I found her in her room, staring at the dress she was meant to wear. I walked over and began to help her with her hair, my hands steady and calm. I didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her not to be scared. Instead, I told her about the fear I felt when I started my first company, the fear of being a woman in a man's world, with nothing but an idea and a shoestring budget. I told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the act of moving forward despite it. I told her that tonight wasn't about Mark. It was about her. It was the night she would take her life back. As I fastened a pearl necklace around her neck, the same one my husband gave me on our wedding day, I met her eyes in the mirror. I told her that no matter what happened in that ballroom, we would walk out of it together, and we would be free. An hour before we were due to leave, I was scrolling through a business journal's website on my tablet when they posted the first red carpet photos from the gala's cocktail hour. And there he was, Mark. He was standing with 2 of his board members, a glass of champagne in his hand, a wide smile plastered on his face. He looked every bit the triumphant CEO. But I had spent 3 decades reading men like him across polished boardroom tables. I looked closer. His smile didn't touch his eyes. There was a tightness around his mouth, a subtle sheen of sweat on his brow that the camera flash couldn't hide. His knuckles were white where he gripped the champagne flute. That's when I saw it. This wasn't the confident predator I had been preparing to fight. This was a cornered animal, bluffing with its last ounce of strength. The alliance between his public mask of success and his private reality of terror was fracturing. He wasn't on the verge of a great victory. He was a desperate man praying his final gamble would pay off. The realization didn't make me feel pity. It sharpened my resolve. He was brittle. I wouldn't need a sledgehammer to break him. I just needed to tap on the crack in his facade. The drive to the hotel was silent. The city lights streaked past the windows, a blur of glittering possibility. I could feel Sophie's nervous energy beside me, a stark contrast to the icy calm that had settled deep within my soul. I was leaving 5 years of quiet grief and feigned simplicity behind me. I was driving toward an inferno of my own making, but for the first time in a long time, I felt completely whole. At the hotel, I directed the driver to the main entrance for Sophie. Her ticket was waiting. My instructions were simple. Take her seat at her assigned table and be brave. We shared one last Lucas silent pact of a mother and daughter about to go to war. I watched her walk through the shimmering glass doors, her back straight, her head held high. I then had the driver take me around to a quiet service entrance where my own access had been arranged. The muffled sounds of music and laughter bled through the walls. In the ballroom, next door, a king was preparing for his coronation. He thought this night was the culmination of all his plans. He had no idea it was the end of everything. The Isabel he knew, the quiet widow who tended her roses, was about to walk into his life for the last time, and he was about to meet the woman who had taken her place. I slipped into the grand ballroom through a side entrance and found a position in the shadows at the back. A ghost at the feast. The room was a galaxy of glittering lights and clinking champagne glasses. Hundreds of people. The Crème de la Crème of Boston buzzed with an energy of wealth and anticipation. Across the sea of faces, I saw Sophie. She was seated at a table near the front, a pale, beautiful statue in the midst of the chaos, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She met my gaze from across the room, and I gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. Be brave. A few minutes later, the lights dimmed and a hush fell over the crowd. A spotlight cut through the darkness and found Mark as he walked onto the stage to a roar of applause. He drank it in, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace the world. The man I had seen in the photo, the nervous, brittle man, was gone. In his place was the king, confident and radiant in his element. He strode to the podium and began his speech. He was brilliant. I had to give him that. He spoke of innovation, of vision, of the relentless pursuit of progress. He painted a masterful picture of Innovitech as a titan of industry, a company not just succeeding, but changing the world. The lies flowed from him as easily as breath, each one more audacious than the last, and the crowd was captivated. I stood in the darkness, a silent witness to his grandest and final performance. Then came the moment I knew was coming. He paused, a theatrical, humble smile on his face. He told the audience that none of this would be possible without the support of one person, his rock, his inspiration. The spotlight swung away from him and landed on my daughter, my beautiful, supportive wife, Sophie. The entire room turned to look at her. A smattering of applause broke out. I watched Sophie's face. She didn't smile. She didn't blush? She simply held his gaze from across the room with a cold, clear stillness that I had never seen in her before. In that moment, I knew her last illusion had just been shattered. Mark turned back to the podium, his voice booming with excitement. And it is that spirit of partnership that will launch us into the future. He declared, "Tonight, I am thrilled to announce a new era for Innovitech, made possible by a landmark investment from one of the most respected venture capital firms in the country." He was milking the moment, letting the tension build. The name was on the tip of his tongue. The entire room leaned in. That was my cue. From the back of the ballroom, I began to walk. My heels clicked with a steady, deliberate rhythm on the marble floor. It wasn't a rush, but a procession. A few heads turned, then a few more. A confused murmur rippled through the tables closest to me, spreading through the room like a virus. Who was this woman? Where was she going? Mark saw me. His flow faltered for a second. His face cycled through a series of emotions, first a flash of confusion, then deep annoyance. Assuming his simpleton mother-in-law was lost or drunk, an Avena assistant moved to intercept me, but I didn't break my stride. I calmly took the offered microphone from his hand as I passed. By the time I reached the edge of the stage, the entire ballroom was silent, watching me. Mark's face was a mask of contempt. "My name is Isabelle Laurent," I said, my voice calm and clear, echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. I looked directly at him, letting him feel the weight of my presence. Then I delivered the line that would bring his world crashing down. "And I am Sterling Ventures." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Mark's smug expression froze, then melted into a slack-jawed mask of pure shock and disbelief. Sophie's eyes widened, a dawning, horrified understanding flooding her face. "As the majority owner of the entity you've been courting," I continued, my voice as cold and sharp as glass, "I've conducted a rather thorough due diligence. On my signal, The giant Innovatech logo on the screen behind Mark vanished. It was replaced by a slide showing two spreadsheets side by side. On the left, Innovatech's real, disastrous financials. On the right, the fraudulent, glowing projections he had been shopping to investors. And what I've discovered is fascinating. The slide changed. A scanned copy of the loan agreement with Sophie's forged signature collateralized by her trust fund. The slide changed again. David Chun's meticulous ledger, detailing Mark's direct orders to falsify reports. Then came the finale. The screen went black, and his own voice filled the silent room. A secret recording Arthur had obtained of Mark on the phone with a friend. His smug, arrogant voice bragged about how easy it was to manipulate his rich wife and keep her foolish old mother in the dark. He just stood there, paralyzed in the spotlight. The applause, the adoration, the power, it all evaporated, leaving him exposed and utterly alone. He looked from the damning evidence on the screen to the stunned, horrified faces of his board members, to the devastating clarity in his wife's eyes. His entire life, his empire of lies, had been dismantled and destroyed in 90 seconds, broadcast live to everyone he had ever tried to impress. The audio recording clicked off, and the silence that followed was the most profound, most absolute sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a world ending. The silence in the ballroom lasted for what felt like an eternity, and then chaos erupted. 100 different sounds at once. The frantic clicking of cameras from the press table, the shocked, urgent whispering of the board members, the screech of a chair as someone stood up too quickly. Mark remained frozen on the stage, a statue in the harsh glare of the spotlight, his face a canvas of utter ruin. I didn't watch him for long. My part in his destruction was over. I walked to Sophie's table, took her cold hand in mine, and said the only thing that mattered. I told her it was over. Together, we walked out of that ballroom, leaving the wreckage of his life behind for others to pick through. We didn't look back. The fallout was as swift as it was brutal. Mark's downfall was the lead story on every news outlet the next morning. The board of directors fired him via an emergency clause in his contract before the night was even over. Federal agents, armed with the evidence package Arthur had delivered, arrested him at his home the next day. He was charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and embezzlement. The beautiful life he had built on lies evaporated. His mistress, Chloe, disappeared the second the money was gone, proving she was just another one of his fraudulent investments. He lost his job, his reputation, his freedom, and every last cent he had tried to steal. But this story isn't really about his ending. It's about ours. In the weeks that followed, I watched my daughter transform. The initial shock and grief of his betrayal gave way to a quiet, steely resolve I had never seen before. She filed for divorce and personally oversaw the lawsuit to reclaim every asset he had stolen from her trust. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor, actively dismantling the cage he had built around her. Instead of letting her drift, I brought her into my world. The hell won. I took her to the offices of the Laurent Group, the heart of the empire I had built. I showed her the balance sheets, the property portfolios, the investment strategies. For years, Mark had made her feel that she was bad with numbers, that the financial world was too complicated for her. It was another one of his tactics of control. But as I walked her through my life's work, I saw a new light ignite in her eyes. She wasn't just understanding it. She was excelling. She had an intuitive, brilliant mind for business, a talent her husband had tried to bury. She started asking questions, then offering suggestions, then formulating strategies of her own. And that's when I had my own revelation. It was my final, most important plot twist. As I watched Sophie find her power, I realized that for years I had believed my greatest accomplishment was the fortune I had built. Then, for a few short weeks, I believed it was the intricate and perfect revenge I had executed. I was wrong on both counts. My true legacy wasn't in the buildings I owned or the men I had outsmarted. It was standing right in front of me. In saving my daughter, I had saved myself from a quiet, hollow retirement. I had rediscovered my purpose, not as a CEO, but as a mentor, a partner, and a mother in the truest sense. The empire felt meaningful again, not as a monument to me, but as a foundation for her. Today, Sophie isn't my timid daughter anymore. She is my partner. Together, we used my controlling interests to restructure Innovatech from the ground up, turning it into the genuinely innovative and ethical company it was always supposed to be. Sometimes, I look out at my garden, at the roses I still tend to on the weekends, and I smile. Mark Covington made the mistake of his life. He looked at a quiet suburban home and saw weakness. He looked at my daughter and saw an asset. He looked at me and saw a foolish old woman. He never realized he was a pawn who had picked a fight with the queen. Our story is a reminder that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and waiting for a reason to awaken. It's a story that proves you should never, ever underestimate the person sitting across from you. It's a story I feel could have happened anywhere, in any city where secrets are kept behind closed doors. It makes me wonder where all of you who have followed my journey are tonight. I'd be so moved to know what city you're listening from, to see just how far one woman's voice can truly travel.